Hello everyone, welcome to the Markets and Revenues session. We are just going to sit here quietly for a few minutes whilst we just wait everyone to join in. Those of you just joining in, we are here. Welcome to the session. We're just waiting a few more moments for the attendees to all log in. So bear with us for a few moments. Great, it's great to see more and more people joining. For those of you who literally join in every second, we're just waiting for the full attendees list to increase. So we'll just be one moment. Right, good morning everyone. The participants list is increasing, so I'm going to start with a few intros as we continue to log in. Then we'll get straight into the session. So welcome to the Markets and Revenue session, building the business case for storage and how revenues will change in a net zero world. This is an event hosted by the Electricity Storage Network, which is run by Region. The ESN is a membership organisation regarded as the voice of the UK electricity storage sector, who host multiple working and engagement groups throughout the storage industry. So the attendees list is still increasing, so that's really great. Welcome to everyone just joining. I'm Kelly Clutterbuck, your chair for this session. I am head of development at Voltalia. We're a global renewables and storage IPP and service provider. Who develop, own and operate assets, as well as provide third-party services throughout the UK and worldwide. I'm also the 2020 chair for the ESN Markets and Revenues Working Group. For those who are not familiar, the Markets and Revenues Group is an industry-leading group created to discuss pretty much everything related to storage revenues within the sector. We cover key market opportunities, new business models for storage. We include future plans from system operators and distribution system operators. We also cover existing and emerging markets and all relevant policy very closely. So it's a great group of industry professionals. So if you're not already a member, don't hesitate to get in touch with the team for further details. So back to the main session. I think we've got a nice full group here. We're delighted that today's session is supported by LCP, Lane Clark and Peacock LLP, who last week launched their new paper, Is Battery Storage a Good Investment Opportunity? It will be presented shortly to us by Rajiv Gogner and Chris Matson. It's perfectly timed, as we all know that as we continue to decarbonise the power sector, the need for flexible technologies such as storage is set to grow, and it also comes at a time when the government and the electricity system operator are really starting to have those serious conversations about what electricity markets look like in a net zero system and how they incentivise zero marginal cost technologies and flexibility. So following Chris and Rajiv's presentation, I will open up to the Zoom floor to our wonderful panellists. They will give you an introduction to themselves, but I'd like to welcome Madeline Greenhall, Policy and Advocacy Manager at the ESN. We are also joined by ESN regular Mike Ryan, UK Commercial Director from Habitat Energy, and Suleiman Ilyas Jarrett, Head of Electricity Flexible Markets at BEIS, along with our presenters from LCP. Before I hand over to LCP for the presentation, just to have a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, Hoover. So, as you're all probably aware, for this series, we have now moved to a new platform, which provides you with increased interaction with other delegates, speakers and sponsors. So if you haven't done so already, we would recommend downloading the app, even though it's the last day, that it's still worthwhile. There's lots of opportunities to participate in community boards and request one-to-one meetings via the app. So I do recommend downloading it and logging in. Some of you would have decided to watch this session in Hoover, and some will be watching on the Zoom platform. Your questions can be sent in using the QA function in both platforms. For Hoover, this is on the right-hand side, and for those of you in Zoom, I'm sure you're very familiar. It's at the bottom of the screen. Due to time constraints, unfortunately, we will not be taking questions through the raise your hand function. So I do encourage you to raise your questions in the chat, and we will be able to see them. Also, log in, say hello to the ESN team. Feel free to comment what's being said throughout the presentation, and chat to other delegates. Again, I think the chat function for those in Hoover is found on the right-hand side, and again, in Zoom, it's at the bottom. So without further ado, I will hand over to LCP, who will start their presentation.
Thanks, Kelly. So hi all, I'm Rajiv Gogner at LCP. I'm a partner in the energy analytics practice. Just as a 2-minute background to who we are, in case you don't know us, we're a financial services consultancy. On the energy analytics side, I guess we've been going for just over a decade now, probably most known for our work with key decision makers. So we provide the UK government with their primary energy forecasting models, so used to assess policy impact analysis, the annual projections, and the modelling behind the white paper this year as well. We also provide the modelling to National Grid to set the annual capacity market requirement recommendation, the tools that Ofgem use to assess network charging reforms, and the modelling framework that the LCCC used to set the CFD levy rates. With industry, we work across the spread of industry, providing power market forecasts and asset valuations. And my particular role, I head up the LCP Enact team, which is our real-time trading and analytics tool, and we'll see a little bit about that later on as well. So today we're obviously going to be talking about building the business case for battery storage assets. My colleague Chris will really be looking at the future markets and where we see battery revenues going, really picking up on our report launched last week, which I encourage you to read. But if Hannah, we could just jump forward. I'll actually be just taking a step back and having a look at how have we got to this point where there is this huge level of interest in battery storage and an increasing deployment as well in the market. Great, so if we could just jump to the next slide. So really over the last 18 months, we've seen market conditions change quite significantly, which have created an almost perfect storm for this interest in batteries and deployment. So I guess firstly, the background of renewable generation, so particularly thinking about wind deployment, we can see that on the right, just wind generation by month over the last few years. And we've really seen that sort of triple over the last few years. And that's increasing that market volatility that battery storage is particularly well placed to capture on. Planning regulation changes that remove the effective 50 megawatt cap, which is going to allow that larger scale storage to be deployed in the future. BSUOS reforms to avoid the double charging on storage, again, improving the day-to-day case. Trials with National Grid. So over the last year, there have been a number of trials run with National Grid to help them get more comfortable with how they can actually call upon batteries, particularly around balancing mechanism, how they can call on them for reserve, and then feeding on to the next point, the ancillary markets as well. So obviously we've seen the very successful deployment of dynamic containment in the last few months, and we have both more ancillary products to come in the dynamic markets and an increase in the capacities being procured. And then not only that, we do have slightly more of an ecosystem around battery storage now. We have more optimizers in the market. Obviously, we're joined by Habitat in the panel today. There are a number of optimizers in the market as well now, and dedicated funds. So Gresham, Zenobia, etc. Huge amounts of capital, particularly directed at UK battery storage assets. So I guess that's how we've really got to this point. And just looking at, I guess, the year in numbers or in pictures. Here we just have a few screenshots from Enact, looking at how batteries are performing in the different markets. So top left, we've got battery PNs, so physical notifications in the wholesale market. I guess the key takeaway there is each colour representing an asset. Earlier, even in 2020, we were really only seeing one, maybe two assets in the wholesale market. That's really changed towards the end of the year, and particularly on that October onwards, we're seeing a large number of entrants in the market. Moving to the balancing mechanism in the top right, again, seeing increases in the activations being called on in battery assets, particularly picking up in that September window where we're looking at the reserve from storage trials. And then, of course, really dipping off in October because those that could moved into dynamic containment. And that's what we're seeing at the bottom there. So starting on 2nd of October, going from less than 100 megawatts to almost 400 megawatts now every day being procured in the dynamic containment market. And we, of course, do have the other frequency response markets as well, which we'll come on to. So I guess we've already seen batteries operating in multiple markets. I think the key focal point of attention has been dynamic containment so far. So if we just jump to the next slide, I don't think it's any surprise to anyone, it's been the most lucrative of the ancillary markets, sort of head and shoulders above. So that top chart there, we're just looking at what the average availability price looks like across a day. And you can see that red line at the top is dynamic containment, head and shoulders above the monthly and weekly frequency response markets, and store at the lowest there. And then just looking at that as a picture on the bottom chart, again, we can see that that average across the year with dynamic containment at the highest level, but also the fact that it's completely concentrated in batteries. So you only have the red dot there, the size being the volume accepted. So we've had the largest battery deployment in dynamic containment, but no one else is able to compete there. And the lack of competition relative to the 500 megawatt cap moving to a gig has kept that price up at that £17 per megawatt per hour. So that's been great to really start building out or proving the value of these services. But if we move to the next slide, while that's been an incredibly lucrative opportunity, there have actually been better opportunities in the merchant markets. So the first couple of weeks of this year, in a perfect storm of a number of events, has seen day-ahead prices hitting £1,500, cash out prices hitting £4,000 a megawatt hour, and batteries who exited dynamic containment and went in for the wholesale approach were able to make significantly more revenue in these cases. So the bottom chart there is just showing how those day ahead and cash out prices fared against each other. And on the top, what we've done is overlay battery PNs, so those wholesale activity notifications, on top of those day ahead prices in black. And what you're seeing there is those battery PNs really spiking on those peaks, hitting them very well, and obviously the corresponding bids earlier in the day where batteries are charging to be able to deliver those peaks. And so if we can just jump to the next slide, please. So what we're seeing here is really the summation of all that. So this is a screenshot from Enact. One of the features in Enact is a live leaderboard, both for the real-time day or historic data, where across all technologies, actually, we calculate their expected balancing wholesale and ancillary profits. So what I've done here is just filtering it just to batteries, filtering it just to the first 2 weeks of January, and highlighting, I guess, 3 tranches in that net profit column there. Down at the bottom, still very strong revenues, but the batteries there at the bottom of those really gaining most of their revenue from the frequency response markets. That blue bar there are really those capturing that dynamic containment, so significantly more revenue being available there, up to that £17 level. But then right at the top, it's actually those batteries that did take the step to exit dynamic containment where the opportunity arose and enter wholesale. And they were really hitting those £1,500 peaks. And I'm sure we're going to be talking today about the DC and BM stacking and how that's going to be unlocking even more stacking opportunities. But this is already really proven the case both for stacking and the need to be fluidly moving between markets. And so with that, I'll hand over to Chris, who will then talk through what those markets look like going forwards.
Thanks, Chief. Yeah, so I'm Chris Matson. I sort of head up the long-term forecasting here at LCP, and I'm going to have a look at this, what the long-term outlook for battery storage looks like, given the changing state of the market. It's just going on to the next slide. And I apologize in advance for anyone who has already seen this presentation. I've given it a couple of times this week, but they say you have to hear something 7 times before you take action on it. So maybe there's something in that. So I guess I'm going to break down this presentation. I'm going to look at each of the different kind of main markets where battery storage can capture value in turn. So, I mean, there are more sources of revenue than the 5 you see on the screen now, but these are the 5 I'm going to focus on. So ranging from kind of capacity market, where you can lock in 15-year contracts, right through to frequency response markets, where you're acting on sort of sub-second response times. Just going on to the next slide. And we can kind of characterize these markets based on what for different types of battery asset, where they're going to be capturing value. So not all battery assets are created equal. They've got a range of different characteristics in terms of things like location, efficiencies, degradation, and so on. Even within the same technology, even when we're looking at lithium-ion batteries. But I guess the key operational characteristic which will determine where you might sit in terms of which of these markets you're going to operate in and which of these markets you're going to capture the most value is going to be your duration. So shorter duration batteries, which at the moment might mean sort of 1.5 hours or less, are going to be more suited to providing frequency response and those sort of short duration balancing market actions, whereas longer duration batteries are going to be less suited to frequency response, but have the potential to capture more value in the wholesale market looking forward, and also capture more value through the capacity market. So just going on to the next slide. So I guess looking at the first, starting I guess with frequency response. So up until now, I guess this has been the primary source of revenue for battery storage assets in the UK market, and we've seen, I guess, some quite lucrative opportunities for batteries over the past few years. So just looking at the chart on the right, that's looking at the dynamic FFR prices over the past 2.5 years. We saw them peaking mid 2018 up to £12 per megawatt per hour. Then we saw a lot of competition coming into the market, and those prices crashed down to around £4 per megawatt per hour by the end of 2018. And that's sort of the sort of boom and bust sort of cycle that we're likely to see in some of these markets, which are quite shallow and therefore susceptible to being saturated through the entry of competition. We're currently probably seeing the boom for the dynamic containment service. So as Jeev has already pointed out, that came in October, and we're seeing prices hitting that imposed cap of £17 per megawatt per hour because you have it's quite stringent requirements on which batteries can take part in that. And at this stage, that's limited competition. And that's obviously very lucrative. I mean, that £17 per megawatt per hour is equivalent to £149 per kilowatt per year, which is significantly more than you're able to make through the merchant markets at the moment. However, if we're to look forward, those markets are quite shallow. There's only so much frequency response that you need in order to respond to the range and how much could trip off the system at any one time, and therefore how much you need to respond in terms of overall total megawatts. So they are susceptible to cannibalization, and we would expect that to happen in the dynamic containment market over the coming months or years. However, in the long term, I guess we don't expect these markets to crash to zero, because what we do expect to see is that those markets will be, the prices in those markets will be set by the opportunity cost of the revenues that you're foregoing in those kind of merchant markets. So, the opportunity cost of not being able to participate in balancing and not being able to participate in wholesale markets will mean that you'll be those will be what sets the actual value of those frequency response markets. Adjusted for some factors such as the additional risk that you might have to take in merchant markets and their sort of avoided cycling costs because you have to cycle more often if you're in a merchant market, so there's more wear and tear on the battery. I guess there's also the potential for more of these, new services to come through in these sorts of areas. So the system is going to have a problem moving forward in terms of inertia. So in that case, you're looking at even faster frequency response markets potentially coming forward. Yes, moving on. So yeah, so the balancing market. I guess what I mean by the balancing market here is energy imbalance. So this is the actions that National Grid is taking in real time to balance supply and demand, where you've got, I guess, discrepancies between what was forecast and what's actually outturning. So that's wind forecasting error, demand forecasting error, and plants availability being different from what was expected. Typically, these prices are much more volatile than the wholesale market. So you're having to call upon more expensive actions over those short time scales. And you're also, the market's flipping between the system being short and the system being long from hour to hour, as opposed to wholesale markets where you're kind of much smoother. And you can see on the right there, over the past 2 or 3 years, what the sort of value has been in the sort of energy imbalance market. So here we've simulated what a 1 hour battery could have achieved using a relatively conservative strategy in terms of the number of cycles it's actually doing. So looking at around just over 1 cycle per day, what it could have captured in the balancing market versus the day ahead market. And you can see there that it could have earned almost 3 times as much through the balancing market, around £30 per kilowatt compared to only 11 in the day ahead. So that's, I guess, to put that in context, that's around the equivalent of those FFR prices we were looking at a moment ago of 4.8 per megawatt per hour. That's if on average throughout the year. And I guess that's why, I guess that's quite low relative to some of those FFR prices we've seen, which is why a lot of battery storage assets have been operating with a FFR strategy so far. So how do we see these balancing market revenue opportunities changing going forwards? I guess there are a lot of fundamental reasons that we expect these revenues to remain strong, at least in the kind of short to medium term. We've got increasing levels of renewables coming on the system. That will mean these imbalance volumes become a bit larger, and it also means that you're driving down those kind of low prices. So looking to see more of those negative or zero prices on the kind of sort of off-peak side of things. And at the other end of the scale, those sort of peak prices we expect to see being pushed up through more volatility, through commodity prices recovering, and through tighter margins in general, as we've sort of seen over the first couple of weeks of this year. But I guess on the flip side of that, the energy imbalances are relatively, in the context of the overall system, are still relatively small. So on average, you'll see these are about 500 megawatts, maybe up to 2 gigawatts in a particularly high hour. But ultimately, those like those sort of frequency response markets, as I already mentioned, are susceptible to competition because they are relatively shallow markets overall. And I guess the danger there from a battery storage asset, which is relying on these revenues, is that you've got potentially a number of different sources of competition other than just battery storage assets themselves. So more reciprocating engines coming to the market, potentially interconnection participating in this market, and so on. Just moving on to the next slide. So the wholesale market. So I guess this is the most deep and liquid of all of the ones that we're talking about today, particularly at the day ahead stage. But I guess, as I've already mentioned on the previous slide, that the revenue opportunities in this market so far have been relatively limited for battery storage. And the main reason for that is just that the spreads, so the kind of difference between your peak prices and your off-peak prices, has not been sufficient, or not been as high as we see in, for example, the balancing market. And that's what that chart on the right there is showing. So we've seen the price spreads, and by that I mean the difference between the highest price during the day and the lowest price of the day on average, in the day ahead market have been sort of in the 20 to 40 pounds per megawatt hour range, whereas in the balancing market we're looking at around double that. And we've seen that kind of spike up in the last couple of months with some of these really tight and extreme winter prices. But generally, this has not been enough to build a business case on for a battery storage assets. So it's been looking, it would be looking at some of those shallower frequency response and balancing markets. However, I think there's cause for optimism here. So for some of the reasons that I've already mentioned, we expect to see those spreads in the wholesale market increase. So we've got a lot of renewable capacity coming online. So as you probably all know, we've got 40 gigawatts of offshore wind targeted for 2030. A lot of that's, 9 gigawatts of that is already committed to come through over the next few years. And that's going to mean more of these very low, so zero or negative prices coming through. We've got gas prices recovering, which will feed into higher power prices over the peak periods. And just in general, those prices becoming peakier as a result of gas plants having to turn on and off over shorter periods, which means that they'll have to recover those start costs that they incur over shorter peaks. And just in general, the system becoming tighter. So over recent years, the system has had an oversupply of capacity, and we've only really seen us get close to that kind of actual target, our lolly of 3, so what the security standard for the system is going forward over this winter. And that's one of the reasons we've seen these really high prices over the past month or two. But as with, sorry, just going back for a second, but as with some of the other markets, there is probably also a word of caution here. So, although this market's much deeper and much less susceptible to competition and saturation than the others, we do have more flexible capacity coming online through interconnection, potentially as we look further into the future through long duration storage and so on. The other word of caution here is the CFD reform for allocation round 4 means that BEIS has proposed means that those supported assets going forward will not receive support payments when prices at the day-ahead stage are negative. And what that means is we're unlikely to see large amounts of negative prices in the future, and I guess more often that will be floored at zero. Okay, just moving on to the next slide. Locational balancing. So I think last year, 2020, we saw 3.6 terawatt hours of wind curtailed, and in almost all cases, that wasn't a case of there being too much wind on the system at a national level. It was a case of there being too much wind on the system at a regional level. And Scotland in particular has seen a lot of periods where wind is being curtailed as a result of transmission constraints over that boundary between Scotland and England. And then you see, as a result of that, National Grid are paying these wind plant 50 and even £100 per megawatt hour to be turned down. Now that presents an opportunity for a storage asset which can charge during those periods and therefore capture some of those prices rather than turning the wind down. And we've seen that already with pump storage assets in particular doing that in the balancing mechanism. Now, I guess 2020 was a bit of an outlier as a result of very low demand during COVID, but I guess it does give us a bit of a window into the future of where we're going to be in a few years' time in terms of the number of these sorts of actions that are likely to take place. So I think particularly over the next 5 years, and that chart on the right there is showing a prediction or a forecast of what the total costs of managing that constraint on the B6 boundary, which is the boundary between Scotland and England, might look like over the next decade. And you can see that increasing, up to around £900 million in 2026 before we get to the stage where National Grid is actually reinforcing the network through significant HVDC cables and so on. So there's some significant opportunities there for storage assets located in the right parts of the country. And it's not just Scotland, it's other parts of the country as well, which are going to be constrained in the future as you've got lots of interconnection coming to the south, lots of offshore wind coming into the east, and so on. I guess the kind of word of caution on this side again is that this, like some of these other markets, is susceptible to competition coming through. So you've got other forms of flexibility that could be located in these regions to capture these prices and therefore take some of these opportunities away from battery storage. On the other side, you've got other solutions that National Grid is taking, like the constraint management pathfinder, to try and manage these constraints better rather than having to curtail wind. And in the medium to longer term, I think, as I've already sort of mentioned, you do have some significant levels of network reinforcement coming online, which will, I guess, limit the level of opportunities here. And I guess the final thing there is, interconnectors, particularly the interconnectors to Norway, could play a big role in relieving some of these constraints, where an interconnection to Norway can act like a very large storage unit in some ways. Finally, the sort of fifth and final of those main sort of areas of revenue for batteries is the capacity market. So I guess this is a relatively small slice of the pie for a battery storage asset. At least it has been over the last few years. Clearing prices in the capacity auctions have been quite low, so as low as £6.44 in the last T-3. And longer and shorter duration batteries have relatively low D ratings, so around 20% for a 1 hour battery, for example. Looking forward, I guess we do see some potential for these clearing prices to increase. So you've got retirements from the aging nuclear fleet and the aging coal fleet, which means we're likely to need some more firm capacity on the system. And also, just in terms of just there being more missing money, and by that we mean some of the kind of traditional assets not able to capture revenues through the normal wholesale market, and therefore needing to capture that value through the capacity market instead. I guess counteracting that is that as we look further into the future, the stress events, which are kind of defining what these deratings for different technologies are, we would expect the stress events to become longer. And I guess by that I mean, in order to achieve the same lolly of 3, when you've got lots of wind on the system, those events are going to be longer in duration but less frequent, and that means that short duration technologies such as those short duration batteries their D ratings will continue to fall into the future. Okay, next slide. So just trying to bring this all together into one picture. I guess we've got on the sort of y-axis going up, we've got the areas which we see more growth in going forward. And I guess this is sort of worth keeping in mind that some of the markets like frequency response and balancing are quite lucrative at the moment, but I guess we're seeing limitations in how much they can grow going forward. Whereas wholesale market, we see quite a lot of opportunity for growth, but I guess that's from a relatively low base at the moment. And then on the sort of left to right, we're looking at which markets are going to benefit from battery storage having longer durations versus shorter durations. So as I sort of mentioned earlier, the longer duration batteries are going to capture more value through wholesale markets and capacity markets, whereas shorter duration more appropriate for frequency response and balancing. So I think overall, our kind of I think in our battery storage report, we use the term cautiously optimistic. So there are lots of fundamental reasons we think that there's a lot of value available for storage assets going forward. I guess on the other side, which is something we haven't talked about at all, is falling costs for these assets as well. But I guess the word cautious comes in because there are a lot of, I guess, risks in terms of saturation of some of these markets as well. And that's everything I had to say, I think. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you both. I think that's a really excellent presentation and market overview of where we are. So, right, I'm now going to open this session up to the panel. For the audience, please continue to keep your questions coming in through the chat function, and we'll take a look at them as we go through. So before we launch into the Q&A, I'm going to invite the panelists to say hello, to give a very brief intro and quick reflections on the presentation. So Madeline, I'll just come to you first, please.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. And thanks, Rajiv and Chris, for that presentation. That was really, really fascinating. I was taking notes all the way through. It was really, really good. I'd love to see you maybe come to one of our market sessions and discuss that in more detail. I think that's something our members would really appreciate. And yeah, again, thanks for sponsoring this event today. I think, you know, we can't do these things without you guys, and it's great to have you sponsoring, but also giving us your insight. It's super fascinating. So yeah, well, where to start with reflections? I guess the first thing that I noted when you were first speaking is that things seem to have changed in conversation since this time last year. This time last year, we were all kind of a bit head in hands, like what is the future for standalone batteries in a field, you know, and we felt that there was a bit of a reticence in the industry to say what the long-term future was for that. That seems to have changed a lot now. There's a much more positivity. I think DC is a big part of that, but also some of the regulatory changes that you mentioned as well, like planning. So we feel like we're in a much more positive position to look forward. I would say one thing that was of interest was the huge amount of different types of revenues that you mentioned just within that one presentation. We know there are more as well. So there's lots of different revenue streams here. We've always known that for storage, it can provide lots and lots of different types of services. There's lots of different revenue streams, but this is now becoming much more apparent that we're taking advantage of those, the stacking that we saw coming through yesterday. Storage can take advantage of those multiple revenues. But what does that mean in future? I think it just really struck me from your presentation. We need to start thinking much more carefully about how do we model that for storage? How do we look at what a storage asset will be doing in future in those multiple different services? How much will we need? What will it do? What revenues will we be getting? And I think industry can help provide some of that information, but I do think we should be looking to BEIS and to National Grid to be giving us a bit more of an idea of where they see those different services coming into the market and what that means for one battery asset, rather than us just kind of salami slicing, as I think someone in the industry puts it quite well. You know, what does that mean for the whole as a battery? I do think that call for evidence from BEIS that's coming out, well, it came out at the end of last year on future of markets. I think that's a really good opportunity to start looking at what flexibility means, what revenues there are for flexibility, and particularly what that means for storage. So that's just yeah, I could go on for ages, but I'll leave it at that as a quick reflection to tee us up for the rest of the session. Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, Madeline. Mike.
Yeah, hi there. So Mike Ryan, I'm UK Commercial Director at Habitat Energy. And Habitat are a optimizer of battery storage solutions, provide a route to market. Madeline's pretty much stolen almost all of my reflections there on the presentation. A great presentation, and I think both the presentation and Madeline's comments nail it. It's the number of markets or revenue streams that are open to these assets that is key, but additionally being able to dynamically swap between them. And I'm not talking kind of month to month or week to week here. This has to be kind of ether block to ether block, hour to hour granularity, working out where is the most value at any point in time and being able to switch into them. I think that's really key to ensuring you're maximizing the revenue that an asset can earn.
Great, thanks, Mike. And last but not least, Solomon, can I invite you to say hello?
Yes, of course. Unfortunately, I'm leaving my camera off for the time being. Oh, just because my
Oh no, I think we're having some technical difficulties already. So can you hear me? If not, I can I'll do a very brief introduction for you. No, unfortunately, I think we've lost him. Okay, so someone joins us from BEIS, and I'm sure they'll work behind the scenes to try and get him back online so we can join in this Q&A question section. So thank you, yeah, and thank you again, both for the presentation. So I think there's a lot to get through. We've got about 20 minutes, so I'll dive straight into the questions I have. First of all, just quickly, you know, leading on from the presentation, this, I suppose, first question to pick up on the topic which we've just mentioned, and comes back to the fundamental question is seeing these markets changing and shaping the future. It was just mentioned the markets are moving ever so quickly and currently are fairly shallow. So I think there's two parts to my first question. With regards to the view on how these markets are changing, fundamentally, do we see a big issue with this current boom and bust situation which you've mentioned? And I'll throw it straight out to you, Mike, seeing as Chris already mentioned this very briefly. Do you see an issue there with this in the future?
In my mind, the kind of cycle of boom and bust is less an issue in terms of the market design themselves. It's actually the industry's response to those markets that are being created. When we say markets, the boom and bust cycle is ancillary services, and it's industry building business cases built on what are very shallow markets. Ultimately, these currently are all National Grid's markets. They are pretty transparent and pretty clear at the size of these markets for a forward-looking horizon that's as far as they can reasonably go. And so to then build a 20-year business case off the back of it and say we're going to plow all our money into a pure FFR battery, for example, I'm not surprised we then get this boom and bust cycle, and then you end up with some assets out there at the moment, that have cells inside them designed to deliver FFR and actually struggle to deliver dynamic containment, let alone BM or wholesale market type action. And I think that's the real issue there. Is it's building business cases and building assets that can't manage or can't participate in all of the possible revenue streams that causes this issue.
Okay, yeah, no, it's a very good point, and I suppose as the business cases evolve and the projects are being designed for what we see right now, it's how are they truly fit for the future and that more longer term duration. We have very recently seen some quite high prices, which again was just recently touched on. Do you think we're going to be, what's really driving this, and are we ready? I suppose, are we ready? What criticism do you think we're going to see in this short term? Because we find we often get this. We find these assets settle into a rhythm, and they start achieving the prices that they need to make them investable to others, and then we tend to get hit by criticism that actually maybe they're doing a bit too well, and this is driving up prices for consumers. Chris, do you have a view on that? Do we have to be ready for criticism here?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. So we've had a look at these high prices and what's causing them, and it's mainly due to outages from some of the older assets, so nuclear assets that have been offline, coal assets that have been offline, Calon's gas units which are not running at the moment. But I think one thing we need to keep clear is that the system has been designed to operate at a lolly of 3, so have 3 hours per year on average of kind of unserved energy, or it's a shortfall of capacity on the system, and we're not actually had any of those yet. So these high prices are what we would expect to be the norm going forward under the current market design. Now the risk here is that there's an overreaction from government or from potentially National Grid to kind of procure more capacity than potentially is needed in order to kind of I guess deal with some of these high prices, which I think would be an overreaction. I think that the only other point I'd make as well is that storage is part of the solution to this, right? So storage doesn't cause high prices. Storage should be smoothing and reducing those high prices, and on the flip side, bringing up some of those really low prices as well. So I think the storage community can sort of present, make that argument that storage is part of the solution here, rather than something that's causing this problem.
Yeah, great. I don't know, Mike, if you have any different opinion on that. I think I do hope that way the storages continue to be seen as the solution.
Yeah, I'm always remember a friend of mine once saying, if you want to operate a market, you should expect to have some very high prices, and you should expect to have some very low prices, and you should expect to have all the prices in between. And that's ultimately what's happening here. Storage is there, exactly as Chris says, to, yes, engage with the market when it's priced high, engage with the market when it's priced incredibly low, but it is actually acting to smooth that out over time. And that is what we want. if you say, well, no, storage shouldn't be allowed to access these prices, and therefore storage doesn't get built, then I think we'll be in for a shock for just how those prices end up, how high those prices end up going.
Yeah. Okay.
But again, it's a lot more about education in my mind than anything else. Just explaining that this is how the market operates and why actually allowing assets to respond to price volatility is a good thing for the end consumer.
Okay. Thanks. I suppose moving on with kind of prices at the moment. This week we did see the soft launch of operators being able to capture revenues and stack them in both the DC and BM. Do we expect this to be a valuable kind of more future revenue in itself? We talk very much about them being separate and which market should we be in. Do we think this will give more confidence to new investors and to the future market? And Mike, from as you're here from Habitat, I think I will throw this one straight to you.
Yeah, and I suppose I'd be shocked if I went back to the office and hadn't mentioned that clearly we were the first to do this on Wednesday morning, which is fantastic, and adds yet another revenue stream we can access. The ability, but what it's essentially doing is when we're delivering dynamic containment, when we're delivering our frequency response, rather than having to just let the battery charge the way it's designed to, so we can keep providing that frequency response service, we can actually submit prices to National Grid and let National Grid charge us when it's useful to them. So now our charging to deliver frequency response is also helping the system when National Grid needs it. And the upside to us is it means actually it's costing us a lot less to charge the battery, so reducing our cost of delivery. It is great. It's a real boom. I think once the market saturates, and so in the summer it's getting to 1.4 gigawatts, and as more large individual losses connect to the system, more interconnectors, more large offshore wind farms connect to the system, we would expect the requirement for DC to slowly increase over time. But as it saturates, I think what will be interesting then is whether BM stacking is effectively allowing some people to bid in at a lower cost to DC because their cost of delivering that service is lower. And you may actually find that those who are best placed to capture revenue elsewhere will pull out of DC sooner.
Okay, interesting. We've got a question actually from the audience. They've asked us just to quickly expand on that boom and boom bust idea. Comment is, it seems that if all the assets are constantly doing is chasing the highest prices, then no particular service will be stable. Rajiv, do you agree? Would you agree with that?
It's an interesting one. I think we've talked about, if you see these signals, why isn't everyone exiting dynamic containment for wholesale? We obviously saw some batteries doing it and some not. So I guess there's firstly a sort of a risk profile associated with that. Do you want to bank the DC revenue? Do you want to chase the high prices potentially outside that? And of course, if everyone does that, you might erode those high prices and the opportunity is no longer there. So there's almost a game theory equilibrium in that. And then there's the aspect of the cap. So I guess the cap completely makes sense right now in an undersupplied market. We can't have everyone exert market power to DC. But I think what we'd expect both from a National Grid perspective in the short term and in our modelling in the long term, where we see ancillary markets converge to the opportunity costs of operating merchant effectively, is that as we oversupply the dynamic containment market, we will need to see that cap flex effectively, so that assets can price themselves into frequency response according to the opportunity cost of foregoing potential price spikes. And I think we'll need to do that if we want to preserve those levels of frequency response.
Sorry, Suleiman here. Can you hear me on the line?
Yes, excellent.
Okay, great. I've had to dial in with my mobile phone number, but great that you can hear me. I'd like to just jump in with a few reflections,
Please,
sort of from a BEIS perspective, and do feel free to throw things my way now, Kelly, as well, now that I'm back. Firstly, on the point of sort of multiple markets and revenue streams and the role for government in setting some clarity of the role of storage in the future, but at the same time getting that balance right with the individual business decisions of particular firms. I think it's really important that for us, we're making sure that we're making it as easy as possible to move between these markets, as you've mentioned, facilitating that coordination of markets, and also laying out at a very high strategic level what we see the role of storage being in a net zero future. And we're hoping we'll be able to do a little bit more of that in our upcoming smart plan. But then also not over prescribing what we think is needed as government, but trying really to get the market signals right, and to have them as open and participatory as possible, so that developers with much better knowledge of individual plants are able to create sort of the mix of revenue streams that works best for them. Kind of related, I guess, on the point around high prices and the sort of potential blowback that we might get. I think you're right that the way that we need to frame it is in terms of system benefits, because you and I all know that storage is part of the solution, and that the overall system benefits of storage and these high prices greatly outweighs the impact on consumers in most cases. Obviously, there is a need to address where these balancing costs are sort of over and above what they need to be, and whether it's efficiency in the system. But a certain amount of price volatility is kind of healthy and what we need. And I think the messaging thing has to focus on what's the system doing, rather than focusing on these really specific instances of very high prices.
Okay, that's really interesting, Simon. So where do you see those kind of key future revenues falling?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think the distinction between sort of shallow and deep markets is a useful one, in that obviously we see a continued growth in some of these sort of more ancillary issues or ancillary services, and specific things like opening up balancing mechanism, the capacity market, to storage technologies. But definitely in the long term, we would like to see more sort of flexible behavior in the wholesale market itself. And as you'll see in the call for evidence that we put out, alongside the sort of looking at the future of the CFD, we're also exploring whether there's a need to incentivize flexibility, storage included, within existing mechanisms, so things like the capacity market and the contracts for difference scheme. And as I say, hopefully we'll be able to outline more of that in the smart plan, kind of the areas that we're focusing on moving forward. But there's definitely still some uncertainty in the long term, but it's kind of all the services you've mentioned, but an increasing focus as well on things like the wholesale market, CFD, the CM, places where storage is not fully valued at the moment.
Okay, great. And I suppose when we talk about flexible technology as well, and we're expanding that on from just battery storage, and as a developer of both battery and renewables, there's always one kind of burning question I have, and that's these markets in a net, future net zero world. What will really be the link with renewables? Will they, do we expect this to start to work closely together? I know it's a pretty wide question, but open up to that kind of longer term other technology. So renewables plus longer duration. Do we see them working more closely together? Chris, I'll throw that one out to you to start with, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. So I definitely see a need. I mean, when we're looking at a net zero system in 2050, there's definitely a need for longer duration storage, right? And I think there's a point when we look at our modelling and we're looking at relatively short duration battery storage, there's a point where if your scenario has, I won't say too much, but enough renewables on it, then it starts to actually be a bad thing for short duration storage, because you get periods where prices are very low for a long period of time, and then go high for a long period of time. And it's long duration storage which is able to capture that value and also provide the system with what it needs in those cases. So definitely a movement over that long term, and by long term we're looking all the way out to 2050 for longer duration storage, and it acting, and it makes sense for it to be kind of acting closely together with renewables. And you've seen some ideas like having electrolyzers out offshore next to offshore wind and those sorts of things as part of the solution. So I think there's obviously definitely a role for those short duration storage, particularly in the kind of medium term over the next decade. But I think beyond that, there's a need in the system for long duration storage.
Okay, great. And Mike as well, I mean, what sort of markets do you think will be providing that revenue for those types of markets?
So I think, trying to point out, well, what markets are they going to be for longer duration storage at the moment is really difficult to do. As Chris mentioned, over time we would expect market signals to come through in the wholesale markets, but almost all of the ancillary services that exist right now are power services, essentially. They're not interested in energy. There's a large element that even the balancing mechanism is actually looking at power in terms of how it's operated. Power at individual cardinal points, individual points on the demand curve, rather than saying, actually, I'm looking for a block of energy at a given point in time. And long duration storage, by definition, needs an energy signal, something that's saying, actually, there's a big volume of energy that has value at another point in time that's significant enough to justify the capex cost of building it. I think that will come. I think there will be a place of it for it. I think it's probably just going to take longer than a lot of people expect, in the exact same way it took longer than a lot of people expected for short duration storage to get off the ground and really start running. On the point around renewables, when there's a lot of renewables on the system, it can cause sustained periods of low prices or high prices. I think there's then really interesting correlations between what happens to the system itself rather than the market when you have sustained periods of very high wind, very low wind. It's the same periods of very high wind. Actually, that's when things like your constraint management services are valuable, inertia services are valuable, reactive power services are valuable, and frequency response services are valuable. So there's an interesting mix going on here. I think that's an area where National Grid needs to become much more dynamic in terms of, we talked about the CAF earlier, how it's valuing some of these services and the prices it's willing to pay.
Great, thanks, Mike. I'm just very conscious of time. Actually, we haven't really had long enough. I've got loads more questions for all the panelists, but we only have a few minutes left. So I think I'm going to have to now start wrapping this up. So I'm not going to throw any more questions out there, and I'm sure we can. There's some questions online on the online Q&A. I'm sure maybe after this, if we can log on to the chat and keep the conversation going, then that would be really great. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the panelists, and really thank you, LCP, for sponsoring this event, and to everybody for joining us today. Before we leave, just one final point from me, just to re-highlight the ESN. We are committed to creating an environment where storage can flourish. Here we go. Thanks, Hannah. And so please do get in touch, join the conversation, join the working groups, get in touch with the ESN teams if you've got any further questions. It's a really great network. I find it personally a real enabler coming into the market, but also the continued market support. Today is the last day of the marketplace. There is an afternoon session at 2:30 where we'll be discussing sustainable mineral supply chains, chaired by Catalina Rosso from Zenobi, talking about opening up the debate about how we can avoid mistakes of previous extractive industries and solutions of way to reduce extraction to create sustainable storage industry for the future, because it is, as we know, it's along with the revenues, it's just as important that we are creating a responsible market. So thank you all again. I say please continue to engage on the chat, but for now, just thank you. Keep safe, keep well, and we'll see you again.